So today I want to make a simple tool that is going to be super useful to all woodworkers. And as a bonus, it's not even hard to make. But I've just realised that in order to make that tool, I need to make some jigs and tools along the way to help me out. 5, I think. But they are all equally useful and equally easy to make. And this is actually a real insight to how my days generally go. But I promise you, it's going to be a fun journey. So let's get started. Oh yeah, and this video is sponsored by Squarespace. We're going to go in a full circle. But let's start off by talking about the tool that I actually want to make, the end result. Let's call it Tool 1. It's just a few thin strips of wood held together by a bracket. And that's it. Simple, right? Kind of. But all of the strips need to be hand planed down to a set thickness and a smooth finish. And don't get me wrong, I've got loads of planing stops that I could technically use to do this job, like this one, or even this one. But unfortunately, they've all got the same issue. They all sit above the strips, so I can't actually hand plane the strip in its entirety without actually bashing into the plane stop itself. And that's not ideal. Plus, as a really minor issue, I can't actually leave these planing stops on top of the workbench while I do other stuff because they just get in the way. In truth, this has actually bugged me for quite a while, but I've been putting off making a solution. Until now. So what I actually need is a plane stop that is not only height adjustable, but is easy and quick to set up and put away. It's genuinely probably something that 90% of us actually need. So let's quickly knock it up before we go any further. Now the simplest way to do this is actually to just get a piece of wood and clamp it to the side of your workbench. Butt anything you want to plane up against it, and away you go. And it's even easier if you have a T-track or dovetail grooves along your side of your bench that you can use. Well, not quite for me. My tracks are on the side of the workbench where I'd have to be left-handed to actually make the planing stop work. So the stop actually needs to be on this side of the workbench where I've got no tracks. And I know, I could easily add some track or some dovetail grooves. The other issue is I don't want to be constantly using 2 clamps to get this job done. Not to mention I'd have to find them and dig them out of a drawer every time I want to do some hand planing. And the other issue is they stick out. I'm going to walk into them. So what I really want is the planing stop to be there all the time, but out of the way. And, well, you'll see. And so to attach it, we're going to need some star knobs. They're the best solution. But it did bring up an issue in this case. I've only got one. So I can't finish the plane stop right now. I'm going to need to make another jig first. So you see the rabbit hole we're going down. But I promise you, by the end of the video, you're going to have 5 very useful tools and jigs. And they will all be completed. As I said, this is just an insight into how most of my days go. So with 2 projects on pause, we now need to make some 20mm dowels. And I know, don't shout at me, that doesn't sound like it's going to help us make star knobs, but in a cyclical way, we're going to get there. Specifically, I need these dowels to fit in the dog holes on my workbench top, and the reason will become clear. There are far fancier jigs on many other videos, but I am opting for the easiest and quickest way to get this job done. Well, apart from buying the dowels, of course, which you could do, if you need to. And on this very rare occasion, I'm not going to show you all of the trial and error, I'm just going to show you how I got the job done. First of all, I drilled a pilot hole as straight as possible, and then I followed that with the 20mm Forstner bit that I drilled the original dog holes with, or just grab the Forstner bit that matches whatever size dowel you need for your dog holes. Once you've drilled it into a nice thick block, take that to your table saw, bandsaw, circular saw, and make a cut so that the very top of each of the holes that you've made is exposed. And you'll see in a sec, there's a reason why I've done 2 holes here. Next, you need to prepare the wood to make your dowel from. I've cut mine down to just a hair over the size of dowel that I actually need, maybe 1.5 mm to 2 mm. You will need to shape one end down a little bit so it will fit into the chuck of your drill. I mean, this method is only okay, it's not perfect. I'll show you a couple of other ways to do this at the end of the jig. And then take a bit of time to shave the corners down so you're starting to make what looks like a bit of an octagon, and then sharpen off the tip and you're ready to go. And it was at this stage that I was not entirely sure that the size would be absolutely perfect. That's why I've got the second hole, which is a 22mm hole, because then I can make a dowel that I can bring down to size, should I need to. It really is just an experiment to see what size dowel actually comes out of the holes I've made. From the experiments, the one big takeaway that I came up with was don't use the same clamp to hold the wood and the blade down to the tabletop itself. Actually have a separate clamp on the blade itself and a clamp on the wood to hold it to the workbench. That way you get maximum downward pressure on the blade. If you're finding you're getting a lot of burning, there's a very good chance it's because the blade that you're using is actually loose. And I'm using a spare hand plane blade. The angle of the blade itself does matter, So have a little experiment with what angle is getting you the best results. Now, despite all of this haphazard experimental approach, I did get a dowel to work, and it came out the 22mm hole at 21mm in width. It's not bad, but it is a little bit too big. So I sent that dowel again through the second hole, which we drilled at 20mm, and it came out at 19mm. Well, now that's too small. And I really should have seen that coming, right? It's a bit loose for this application, but I'm going to hang on to it for other stuff down the line. And this is basically what I mean by there are better jigs that you can find on the internet to get this job done. But I didn't want to waste too much time on this. This is a quick and dirty method to get a dowel that will work. Just got to experiment a bit. So here's what I did that made it work. I took the 22mm hole, which was producing the 21mm dowel, and I just took a hand plane to the top. And by taking a few of these heavy shavings, I'm just bringing the plane iron closer to the center of the hole. So theoretically, when I pass wood through, I'm going to get a smaller dowel. It's not perfect, and I'm not going to show you the 15 or so fails where I kept experimenting with the angle of the iron. Just know it's possible. This is a way of doing it, but if you want to make something fancy, I get it. Now, I mentioned earlier when I was cutting the one end very small to put into the drill chuck that may not be the best method. I found that snapped quite a lot. There's two solutions. The first one is to try a cheap bit like this. This is a socket, cheap off Amazon, not very well made, that you can use to fit any size of nut. Wedge this onto the end of the piece of wood that you want to send through the dowel, and it should give you enough purchase to send it through. Or screw a cheap threaded insert into the end of the piece of wood, hack the top of a bolt off, chuck that up in your drill, and then send it through that way. Basically, just do whatever works for you to get the job done. And if you've got an old drill, that's probably going to be better for this purpose. Anyway, we've got a nice long dowel. Now we need to cut it down to size. And if you've ever tried to do this, it can be a real pain, especially if you want good results with a nice square cut and repeatable cuts. Let's make a jig for this. And out of all the jigs we make, this may just be the easiest and the most versatile and usable. You just need to make a rough 45-degree cut along a nice chunky block of wood. A simple 2x4 will work fine here. I'm being a little bit vague with the angle because in all honesty, it's not vital to be 100% accurate here. Then cut it in half and we're going to mount it onto a block of ply. Now, like any jig that I make, I want to use the dowels that we cut earlier to lock it into place on my workbench. And it's important to note that as my table dog holes were drilled by hand rather than on a CNC, they're not actually perfectly spaced. The grid's good, but there are slight differences in the gaps between each of the holes. So for that reason, I can't have two fixed dowels on any jig that I make, because they may fit in one set of holes, but they won't fit in another one. So I took my inspiration from the original plane stop that I made, where I solved this problem. And it's a solution that means I can then place this jig anywhere on two adjacent holes, anywhere on my workbench. As you can see, first hole I lined up with one dog hole, and then the second one I brought in 3mm so that they were technically too close for those two dog holes. This just gives us leeway. Now just elongate one of the holes. And I genuinely thought I'd set up the perfect filming angle here for this cut. Not quite. Pretty good advert for a drill though, I guess. Anyway, just know I did some sawing and some testing, and it worked. And then when mounting the 45-degree blocks to the ply, the only part that matters is that they are snug together and that the ends are flush. And I'm going to use CA glue alongside the wood glue to act as a clamp while the wood glue goes off. Because honestly, they are next to impossible to get clamps on. Unless I made a jig. Don't worry, I'm not going down that rabbit hole. Not this time. CA glue works just fine. It's a bit of overkill, but I put some screws up through the bottom as well. Ensure they're countersink so they don't scratch your worktop and that they go into the thickest part of the wedge. And now we can give it a test. We've got to cut a dowel anyway. And the fact that it's going to be square, hopefully, well, that's a bonus. Whew, so the jig works. Even by just getting a square cut on this dowel means that this jig has made my life so much easier. It's what jigs do. And speaking of tools that make our lives easier, before we finish this one and move a little bit closer to our goal, I'd like to take a minute to tell you about this week's sponsor, and that's Squarespace. Squarespace is a tool that makes my life easier. A website to make a website. Businesses are always looking at ways to diversify their revenue streams, and I'm no different. In time, I want to be able to say that I can offer plans, merchandise, special deals, and so much more. And trust me when I say this, I couldn't do any of that without using Squarespace. They just make it so simple, from a product page to payment and inventory control. But remember, you don't have to start with a completed site. I didn't. Start simple and then add on what you need when you need it. Simply visit squarespace.com for a free trial. Choose a layout that works, customise it, find your brand, generally have a good experiment. And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/start making for 10% off your first purchase of a domain or website. And now we've got a jig to finish. If you find that the dowel is still rolling around while you're trying to cut it, all you need to do is line the inside of the wedge with nitrile rubber, cork, a little bit of foam matting, anything to provide that extra bit of grip. And maybe clean up the sharp edges. Now the test dowel's a little bit short, so for the actual dowel we're going to use, let's actually make sure it's the right length. And this is going to be the one that we're going to fix into position. That way I only need to find one bench dog whenever I want to use this jig. You could easily make a second with a cap on it, so you don't need to actually spend money on bench dogs, but to be honest, they're not that expensive. Luckily, the one that I'm fixing into place was a very tight fit, so all it's going to take is a little bit of glue. But I'm going to show you a method later where if it's loose, you can fix that. But what happens if you need a series of dowels all the same length? Well, I'm glad you asked. For that, we're going to need a stop block. So why not do a little bit of over-engineering? And I will say, anybody making jigs, these clamps are vital. They are so versatile, not to mention easy to fit. And then as a stop block, just grab any piece of wood that you're going to clamp down. I was quite deep down the rabbit hole at this stage, so I added magnets so I'd never lose it, because apparently that's what I do. Total over-engineering. Anyway, let's give it a quick test. If you notice that when you come to finish your cut, the dowel is wedging slightly on the stop, just lower the depth of the stop and then it should clear it fine. You'd be forgiven for wondering at this stage where this jig actually fits in with the two projects we've got on pause. I promise you, it's all linked, in a way. Trust me. And I will say again, these are all genuinely useful in their own rights anyway. Okay, so where we're at, we've got a plain stop, but we don't have enough star knobs. And I have to give credit for this jig to one of you lot. Peter, to be precise. He was the inspiration for this jig. Mainly because a while ago he sent me pictures of a jig he made for this exact purpose. Mine, turns out, is not a patch on what he did, but I had an idea in my head and I wanted to see it through, and it works. So let me show you how to make some star knobs. Well, star bolts and star knobs. I'm using scrap plywood here, but you can make fancy ones if you like out of hardwood. In fact, if this works, I'll show you the difference. You need to start with a disc. The neater the better, but you can always sand it down. And in the base, you need a hole that is a nice tight fit for that disc. I found that using the same hole saw for both left a little bit too much play. And if you draw the lines in first for where you're going to drill, that's going to help a little bit later. And don't be afraid to experiment with different amounts of finger holes. I've gone for 4, but admittedly 5 would look better. And you can refine the fit of all of this with either a flappy wheel or a spindle sander. Then simply place your disc in and drill 4 holes where the disc meets the lines that were left in the base. And after the first one, if the disc moves around, you can lock it in with a dowel or a bench dog. I told you the dowel maker was going to be important. And so you've got your first star. Cleanup is easy because we can use the dowel again that we cut earlier. See what I did there? I've added a base underneath to hold the disc at the right height. Well, or so I thought, but we'll come back to that. And I'm using a clamp to keep the disc actually locked in place. And one bit of advice here, if you actually make the jig a little bit larger than mine, you'll be able to place the clamp diagonally onto the disc, which will free up space to drill all your holes without turning the disc. And I'm just drilling a dowel into place to stop the jig from spinning when drilling. And unlike the last jig, this dowel is actually a little loose. One of the slight issues when cutting your own dowels. They're not always perfect. But it is an easy fix. Cut a V in the top and then wedge it. The size of the wedge is quite important. You want it wide enough to spread the wood slightly, but not wide enough to split it. Ask me how I know. Make sure that before you hammer it in, there's a few millimeters left in the V groove so that it's got somewhere to go. And then just get hammering. Glue it in place and the dowel is held tight. And then, well, you can test your jig to realize you've made one crucial mistake. That's right. When you put the disc in, it needs to sit a few millimeters below the top of the jig so that the holes that are already there can actually guide the Forstner bit or drill that you use. And now it's done. There's 2 different ways we can make these into star bolts. One is a simple carriage bolt. The square bit under the head gives the star purchase on the bolt. This is the quickest way. Or you can sink a regular bolt into the star itself and then cap it off to hold it into place. Aesthetically, I like this way the best. Now, another reason why I suggest you make the jig a little bit larger than mine. Even with the dowel in a dog hole, mine still slips around when you're drilling. I've done the best I can by adding this nitrile cork on the bottom, and it'll do a job. But if you want to make the best one you possibly can, then adding a sliding dog like we did before and having the space to do so is the best way to go. So let's take a quick look at the star bolts and the fancy star bolts so you can decide which way you'd like to go. And to me, this is one of the biggest bonuses of making your own tools. You can choose. But now we finally can finish this planing stop. And then we're another step closer to making tool 1. So a few important features of the plane stop. 1, holding firm. 2, being able to move up and down. And when down, it needs to be below the bench top itself. So I need to cut channels for the star bolts to run in. You can do this neatly on a router table or messily with a jigsaw. I chose the latter. And while I'm cutting them, I just want to talk a little bit about wood choice for this. I'm using a lovely bit of what I think is olive wood, but there is a very good reason why I've chosen it. You can use ply, but I would worry that the top would chip out really easily if you accidentally plane into it, which, let's be honest, is going to happen. And this wood not only looks nice, but it's also super strong and easy to plane flat on the top if you do make that mistake. On top of that, it doesn't have a very distinctive grain direction, which I think is important and we'll have a look at in a second. As an aside, if you do make the mistake of going into it with your plane and you run out of wood to shave off the top, simply flip it over and start again. To hold it to the bench, you just need a couple of threaded inserts, and be careful here if you use cheap ones. Remember to countersink them and don't tighten them too far, or else this happens. That's right, I had to re-drill. The countersink's important here because you want it to be set into the bench so it doesn't scrape across the back of the plane stop. And as the wood is so nice, I'm using my new favourite finish. I bought this wood finish from Leo over at Hand I Craft YouTube channel and Instagram. I'm going to leave a link to it down below. Wipe on, buff off. Super simple. And now, let's give it a test. You can have it nice and low for a thinner piece. And also, as an aside, if the piece is actually slipping, just throw something grippy underneath it. If you need more support for a bigger piece, then just raise the stop up. Now with grain direction, I would suggest that if you're using a very straight grain wood that you choose the grain direction carefully. Too horizontal and you risk snapping the board under pressure. Too upright and you get tear out across the back if you accidentally plane into it. Solution? Go for grain upright, but add a slight chamfer to the back of the planing stop and that'll stop any tear out. And now we can finally plane some wood and we can make tool 1. I made a really complicated prototype of this about a week ago and it came out really well, but I decided to simplify it. So here we go. You just need some thin strips of hardwood. Fancy or not, it doesn't matter. I'm starting with 4 and using the plane stop, I've taken 2 of them down so when they're combined, their thickness is around 1 millimeter lower than the other 2. And now to make a very simple box out of the thicker pieces for the strips to slide through. I'm happy gluing all of this with CA glue here, just so I can keep things moving. If you have more patience than me, then you get a better long-term hold with wood glue, but it'll take a little bit longer while it goes off. So the thicker strips make up the side of the box and the thinner strips we're going to use a little bit later on. And here's a little bit about the tool that I'm going to be making while I get everything glued together and planed flush. I like measuring as much as the next maker. And tapes and rulers are fine for many jobs. But when making referential measurements, which I always try to do, you don't need numbers because you're just taking the measurement off something that you've already built or a different stage of the build. And this tool in fact has been used for decades, longer even. The place I use it most is with boxes or drawers. Imagine you're making a box and you've cut the rebates to hold the base or the lid. And you've got it all dry fit. And you need to know how big to cut the piece of wood to go inside the rebates to make the base. Well, a tape measure won't get into the rebates and a ruler is not adjustable enough. So I used to just use a couple of scrap pieces of wood held together with a clamp. And that's fine. But sometimes you want something a little bit nicer. As you can see, the dowel we cut here is vital for the knob to firm up the strips. Okay, you got me. It's not actually vital, and nor was the planing stop to make the strips. But I hope you'll agree, they're both really useful and they'll come in handy in other projects. Make this knob however you like. Use a star knob if that's all you have, and now you can make one. Maybe make a similar jig but smaller to make a smaller star. Anyway, we needed a quick fix here because I made a bit of a mistake. The thread for the knob was actually not square, but that's okay. Just chuck it up on your drill and use that as a mini lathe. And in doing so, you're going to make it look a little bit fancier. For the next bit, you can get away with gluing a nut into the outer square, or if you use cheap threaded inserts like me, which are in effect made of butter, you can file it so that it's the right size that it won't protrude into the inside of the square. And that's what I did. I don't actually know what the name for the outer square is, open box or housing. Anyway, you know which bit I'm talking about. And I know, this is a little bit crude and will more than likely mar the sticks, slides, or whatever part they're called. But as you'll see in a moment, you can replace them easily enough, or make spares. And my initial thought was that this was actually turning out to be too large for what I needed, so I cut the sticks down. I also shaped them so that they tapered down at the ends, allowing them to fit into a standard 5mm or so rebate, and I brought them to a stubby point. I didn't want to round them as I wanted the flat end to reference more accurately against something. I mean, a point would also work, but let's be honest, I don't need any more sharp objects around me than I already have. And rounded overall felt less accurate. So a stubby, flat, tapered end won out. But you don't want them falling all over the place when you loosen them, so add a little stubby block at the end to stop that happening. Oh yeah, and you can add a little bit more fancy with the same finish I had earlier. Thanks, Leo. And for overall versatility, simply cut some different size lengths. You'll be surprised how many uses these, like all the other tools and jigs we make, have. For instance, longer strips allow for draw measurements, whereas the smaller strips more intricate work. And as an aside, I would only use these for internal measurements. External measurements, well, that's what tape measures and rulers are for. And just to show you my initial prototype, so you can see my initial thoughts, we've come a long way. This was actually meant to double as a compass. Too much? You tell me. So that's my journey I took to make this simple tool. Did I embellish it to make it a little bit more interesting and so I could add in a few more jigs? Absolutely. Are they useful? Absolutely. And I've got no doubt that if you've got this far, you're going to have no trouble making them for yourself. Each one alone is a 30-minute workshop win. Make them all together and it's a fun day of building, maybe two. The time isn't all that important. I really hope that this has helped, or was at least entertaining. I want to thank you if you've got this far. And if you're an existing subscriber, thank you again. If you're considering subscribing and you're on the fence still, check out one of these two videos. They're similar to the one you've just watched. And if you do click on them, well, I'll see you over there. Thanks a lot.